Everybody's got a story. You just have to listen. Hola, I'm Joe Pardaville, and this is Good Listen. And as a Gen Xer, I can honestly say the music of our generation was a little strange. I mean, we grew up with Michael Jackson, Madonna, Cyndi Lauper, and then as we grew older, we had that grunge era with Pearl Jam and Nirvana. But then, in the mid to late 90s to early 2000s, there was a sweet spot for rock with bands like Vertical Horizon, Everclear, Bare Naked Ladies, and Better Than Ezra. And that band's frontman is joining me today. His name is Kevin Griffin. Kevin is a amazing singer-songwriter who's worked with the likes of Taylor Swift and Sugarland. So we're going to talk about what it was like back then, what the music industry is like now, and discuss his latest venture, which was a business parable book. So we're getting into all of that today on Good Listen. Kevin, welcome to the show.
Joe, I'm giddy to be here. Finally, after all the haranguing I did, all the bugging and the pestering, you finally let me on the show.
Yes, a lot of haranguing, Kevin, yes. So I want to start this conversation by going way back to the late 90s, early 2000s. My career was just getting going in radio in New York. Your band was blowing up, Better Than Ezra, with the hit song Good. But there was a moment in time there where your band was responsible for one of the greatest Norm Macdonald jokes of all time on Saturday Night Live.
And in music news, number one on the college charts this summer was Better Than Ezra. And at number two, Ezra.
So, if you don't mind, take me back to when you first heard the joke and the band's reaction.
Well, that was in the fall of 95. And, Ezra, that was 95 is when we burst out onto national consciousness. We got together in 88 when we were freshmen at Louisiana State University, but 95 is when it happened. I think in May, June, Good was number one. And so we heard about, and Norm Macdonald was on fire, Weekend Update was it. And we loved it when it came out, that bit to be part of the pop culture of, being mentioned in SNL, even if you're the butt of a joke, and this was just cool. It was just funny. So it was amazing. And, there were a lot of firsts and a lot of moments, to remember that happened that year. Of course, many years later, when Norm passed away and they chronicled his, top 10 bits, his top 5 bits, up there, top 5 was always the Better Than Ezra line. And that's saying a lot because he was a master joke teller and he had so many iconic bits.
Yeah, no, it was awesome. And, I mentioned at the top, I'm Gen X, you're a Gen Xer, and, the late 90s, early 2000s for radio was amazing. There was actually radio stations, in cities and towns all over America, and the music industry was booming. I mean, people were selling millions of albums, touring all over the place, making a lot of money. And the industry, radio obviously has changed, but the music industry has changed a ton in terms of how artists are making money. So when you're working with younger artists today, do you ever reminisce with them about the good old days of the 90s and 2000s?
I always preface it with, at my core, I'm an optimist. While there's always changes and challenges and everyone wants to bring the death knell of whatever the old school was, there's always something new happening. You just got to figure out how to navigate it. That said, the 90s were, I consider myself really fortunate to have been part of the old school music industry when physical albums, CDs, even cassettes still at that time, and vinyl was there a little bit, were selling tons. And as a songwriter, you got paid under that old system. So if you wrote all the songs on a 12-song album, which I did, I wrote all the Better Than Ezra songs back then. When you had a hit album, it was really lucrative because the copyright laws that addressed physical sales of albums, treated the songwriter as an equal to the record label and to the master. So it was great. They were salad days for sure. And it was very cool. And you could depend upon certain things, fast forward, so I do talk about that to the kid. I work with, I'm always writing with, artists in their late teens or early 20s, bands and stuff. I never want to come off as like, oh, you should have seen it back in the day, kid, But at the same time, now you're right. So many artists are the captain of their own ship. I work with some different people who have released albums on their own through DistroKid and TuneCore and all these different aggregators. And there's no middleman. They get all the money from the masters, and they do incredibly well and don't need a label. But it's they're big on TikTok, or like you said, or YouTube or whatever. It's so much harder to have a long career. It happens, and there's tons of money being made in the industry, but it's a different, more rarefied feat to really have the big stardom, being on Saturday Night Live, Letterman, Leno, Conan, which we were able to do. So I consider myself very fortunate. That said, there's more immediacy now and more ability you could be anywhere in the world. And if you have music that translates, that people identify with, suddenly you can go from making the song on your laptop to being the next big thing.
And I want to stick with the 90s for a second because, back then you were able to sell physical albums and then you went on tour. Fast forward to 2025, it's basically all streaming, and bands have to tour a lot to sort of supplement their income. So let's talk about the financial dynamic of what it was like then and the amount of money people are making now just from streaming as opposed to selling all those albums.
Well, if you think of roughly the revenue that comes in on a dollar basis for a song, half of $1, 50 cents goes for the master. That's split off for whoever owns the physical recording, the label or the artist. The other half traditionally would go to the songwriter. Well, what's happened and that was the way it was when CDs were selling albums and stuff like that. Now, though, the last copyright decree that was written in law was the 1972 copyright law. Clearly, it didn't address digital because digital was fantasy. It was the Jetsons. So when it came time for the streamers, Tidal, Spotify, etc., to determine what they're going to pay the songwriters, it's not surprising they decided we'll pay them nothing. We'll pay 0.0000001 per stream. And so as a result, making money from streaming as a songwriter is you don't make any money. Where the money is made, though, is if you're a label and you own that other 50% that the master use, streamers are paying the owners of the master the same as they paid for physical albums. And there's a reason, because the major labels own parts of the streamers, so they're paying themselves. You can still do very well as a songwriter for broadcasts like radio, that the BMI and ASCAP that they collect. But if you're purely a songwriter and you don't own any of that master, you're struggling. That's why I always counsel, artists, know how to produce, know how to get an ownership of that master. Don't give the master up. Keep a piece, even if you sign a deal, so you can get that money. So if you do have a part of the master, you can make a lot of money. The labels now are doing better than they did in the heyday of the old school regime, because so many more people have premium subscriptions to streaming, and the pay that is being paid for the master is the same. So they're crushing. There's a lot of money to be made. You just got to know where to go. And, you just got the old way of making your money as a songwriter has changed. It's like that old book, Who Moved My Cheese, that actually based my book on, there's certain business parables that were hugely successful that I used as kind of inspiration. Who Moved My Cheese, it's about, the abridged version is, these mice in a maze always go to the same place to get their cheese. And then one day that cheese doesn't come the same place. And it's a parable about the mice that stay there thinking it's going to come back to the way it used to be, versus mice that go out to search for where new cheese is. So if you're still sitting there waiting for the cheese to come as a songwriter, it ain't coming. You got to move on.
And I want to talk about some of those eye-opening moments because Years ago, I had Bare Naked Ladies in the studio, and they had just blown up with that song One Week, which everyone still listens to now, 20 something years later. But they were one of these scrappy college bands that go town to town, play at universities, make a few bucks. And then they had dreams of becoming rock stars. So when the song finally did hit, they had aspirations of like, we're going to stay at 5-star hotels. We're going to fly in private jets. And they talked about how they didn't realize that all of that stuff that came on the tour, they had to pay for. Like they got a bill at the end of the tour that they had to pay for. Did you ever have a moment like that when you guys were touring?
Well, it's funny, just bringing in Bare Naked Ladies. Right before we started this podcast, I was talking with Ed Robertson for Bare Naked Ladies. He's a pal. We've written together their past 5 albums, so all their recent singles I get to write with them. There's no funnier or smarter guy than Ed Robertson. We actually we knew that tour support, that's what you call it, tour support. We knew that was recoupable. So there were moments of excess, when we get picked up in a limo by the radio guy in Philly or New York, and he's like, let's go eat, let's go to Ruth's Chris or Capitol Grill, or insert some local, or Charlie Trotter's in Chicago, which was still around. We knew that was recoupable. It didn't stop us, but at the time, all our albums were doing really well. So we were like, it's a drop in the bucket, go. But yeah, it is, back in the day, it was so unfair to the artists because, you just got double dipped and double charged by the labels for packaging for the records. And you didn't know it, but the labels owned the printers. They owned the package. So again, they were double paying themselves and double dipping. But, there's a little bit more equity now. But yeah, those were those rude awakenings.
That's funny. And fast forwarding to today, like I mentioned, you're writing songs, you're still touring with Better Than Ezra, but you also wrote a business parable of a little while ago about creativity. Can you tell me about the inspiration for that?
Well, the inspiration, it started about 6 years ago. They say that nothing good happens in a bar after 2 a.m., especially a bar in New Orleans during Mardi Gras. But one time I ran into a buddy, a serial entrepreneur, a guy named Brady Wood, and he was in town with his YPO group. And everybody listening to this knows what YPO is, Young Presidents Organization. And they had Malcolm Gladwell in New Orleans speaking to them. And Brady just casually said, hey, would you ever want to speak to our chapter in Dallas? And I was like, yeah, I'll do it. And then I went about my way. And a few months later, it was almost time for me to speak to this group. And these are very successful men and women. And I was like, I need to speak about something. And then I realized that, through my career, the ups and downs of, as a performer, then more success as a songwriter, writing for people like Taylor Swift and James Blunt and Sugarland and all these different bands, that I've developed or had to learn different tools and practices to stay successful and inspired and nimble and always evolving. And I realized before I did that first speech that the things I do as a musician to stay successful and creative are things everybody does in their business if they're smart. But the cool thing I could do is I could couch it in the music industry, which is interesting, and I could sing my songs. So I started doing these speeches, and it started with YPOs, and then it went to things like Live Nation and Google and Salesforce and Nike and Disney. And a few years ago, I was really talking to my agent, and they were like, if you want more speaking gigs and you want to do better in them, you should write a book, and I'm an English major from LSU, Louisiana State University. I wrote a book at the beginning of 2000 that I was editing, and then the Hangover came out, and it was a much funnier, better version of my book. I was a little discouraged. But a couple years ago, when my agent said, think about doing a book, instantly I thought about a business parable, and some of the books that I like Who Moved My Cheese, Rich Dad Poor Dad, Tuesdays with Morrie. I love narratives, and a lot of my songs are story based, and so I think that people are able to learn things when they're reading a story, and it's kind of by osmosis. You don't even know it's happening. So I decided to write this business parable about a journeyman songwriter named Jake Stark rather. Living in Nashville, and he gets dropped when we meet him, And in the same week, he gets dropped. He's introduced to this enigmatic 28-year-old billionaire, genius named Sir Daniel Smith Daniels. And yes, I voice all the voices in the Audible version of this. And we find out that they know each other from long ago. But Sir Daniel asks Jake, hey, look, I want you to be part of the hottest music publishing company in Nashville, The Row, which he started. And I want you to write with these 5 writers, and they're gonna demonstrate these 5 practices of something I call the method. And it's how to stay creative, nimble, successful. And because what you find is as you get older in business and in life, that staying creative and being inspired can't be a passive thing. It's got to have intent. You got to go out and seek it. And that's what I talk about in the book. How do you, because when you're young and you're just out of college, you know, you're full of inspiration, like your relationship with your parents, your peers, your first love, your first heartbreak, the music you identify with in college, everything is so fresh. After that, though, you got to go out and seek inspiration, and always growing and leaving the comfort zone and changing your attitude. And that's what I talk about in the book. And I found that it really does have to have intention. And when you do it, it works. And it's not just, something I'm talking about. I really drew off of what people in my business like Max Martin and Pharrell do, and then what the business greats have done, all the going back to Jack Welch and the different stuff. There's all these parallels that people who are successful in business do.
Yeah, it's funny too, because talking about the world of entrepreneurship and the world of music, I often say that artists, musicians, singers, actors, they're the ultimate entrepreneurs. And you probably don't see a big difference, right, between being a musician and being a business owner, right?
It's not at all. You're constantly coming up with new ways to disrupt your business. And how do I approach it a different way? How do I carve out some market share that I haven't done yet? Music is, what I realize is that in my own industry, in music, and in any industry, you think you know the business until you wear a different hat in your own industry. And so I've gone from being a musician and a songwriter to being a publisher, and I've published hit songs for Florida Georgia Line and Morgan Wallen, and I manage artists. I've started a music festival called Pilgrimage Music Festival. I wear a lot of different hats, so I'm always and then I've learned about ROIs and tranches and waterfalls, and I mean things. I'm like, sometimes I'm in these meetings. And then that's led into other investment opportunities. I'm in these meetings and I'm like, I'm just a singer in a 90s band. I'm confused by all these acronyms. But I just dig it, man. I'm always, Better Than Ezra was the band we started at LSU. But after I graduated LSU, I was, I had 3 years where my LSAT was still good, for law school. And I was like, okay, for 3 years, I'm going to give it 3 years to make it as a rock star, in music. Well, those 3 years came and went. The LSAT expired. But I've always had a foot in business and stuff. I like the challenge, and I like wearing different hats. Maybe I'm a little bit of an anomaly as a musician.
Now, was this always part of your DNA, Kevin? Like, were you always wearing hats in the early days of Better Than Ezra and doing a lot of different things?
I wasn't. And there's a famous music manager, a guy named Alan Kovac, and everybody in the music industry knows him. Alan managed Blondie, Meatloaf, the Bee Gees, Motley Crue, still manages Motley Crue. He's a legend in this business. And when Better Than Ezra had been dropped and we were making an album in the early 2000s, we were at a studio called Conway Studio in the heart of Hollywood. It's the same corner that Jane's Addiction sings about. And Jane says, she woke up on St. Andrews. Right at the corner of St. Andrews and Melrose is Conway Studio. And in 2002, we were there. It's still one of the finest studios in the world to go to. The Weeknd's there right now. In 2002, it was Justin Timberlake in Studio A making his Justified album. Better Than Ezra was in Studio 2. In Studio 3 was Meatloaf. And one morning I came into the studio and this older gentleman came up to me and goes, Kevin, it's Alan Kovac. Listen, Meat heard one of your songs and he'd like you to write him a song. And that began, that was the 2 hours later was the first time I ever collaborated on a song. And it's not a coincidence that collaboration kind of became the bedrock for me of how to reinvent myself in my career as a songwriter, but also in my life over and over again. And that's practice one in the book, creative collaboration. And but Alan Kovac told me, as we became better friends about a year later, he said, listen, Kevin, he was not a shy man. He goes, look at what I got. I got real estate. I got management. I got investments. I got blah, blah, blah. You just got Better Than Ezra, kid. You need to diversify. So he really got me thinking, okay, start writing with other artists. That's when I started writing with his artists, the Bee Gees and Blondie, and then had a hit with Howie Day, Collide, and all these other songs and then in short order, collaborating and working outside my band became a lot more lucrative than my own band. And it was because, somebody was a mentor to me.
Now, Kevin, a lot of people always make fun of me because I always like to ask the sliding doors question, the Gwyneth Paltrow movie, what would happen if you made this decision? What would your career have been like if you didn't get this nudge to sort of diversify what you were doing?
That's a good question, man. There's so many things I look back on my career and like, oh, we should have gone with this single. If we released Desperately Wanting as our first single off the second album, it would have been as big as the first one. But at the same time, there's so many things I did do right and that did happen right. One of those was meeting Alan Kovac and having to diversify. So I don't know. Maybe, who knows? Maybe I would have left music altogether. I don't know.
Kevin, one thing I'm really passionate about is talking about self-awareness and time management, how we all have to be better at it. And you have so much going on with, touring with Ezra, writing books, giving speeches. But how do you manage all of this?
Time management, just like everybody, sometimes you feel like despite what you're doing, you're losing momentum and losing track because like, oh my God, I'm so far behind. What really helps me is making to-do lists. I make a list on my phone on memos, probably every couple of days, it just like to do. And that way, just enumerating those things out allows me to put my eyes on it and then it doesn't seem so daunting, the things I've got to do, whether it's shop, or finish looking over a contract, finish this song, get mix notes, whether it's the festival or all these different things, that makes it all seem manageable. And then when I have that peace of mind, like I did that, and then I put a couple asterisks by something like that. And then it also allows that, when you wake up in the middle of the night, that noise, that white noise, like, oh, I got to go do this. And everything in the middle of the night seems so dire. It's weird. It's the weirdest thing in the middle. And then you wake up in the morning like, everything's fine. I'm fine. The last night, 5 hours ago, it felt like it was the end of the world. But when I do those lists, it keeps me on top of those things. I tell you, but when it is crazy, what allows me to keep it all from being overwhelming is exercise. When I exercise in the morning, when I start off I'll get on the Peloton or I go for a quick jog or just anything, not a big workout. It just levels me out. Just whatever tension, stress I'm feeling, if I feel like I can handle it.
And Kevin, how do you explain your longevity? Because you and I both know a lot of the bands that you came up with back in the good old days, as we said, are struggling now. I mean, they have to tour basically 365 days a year just to make ends meet. So how do you explain how you've lasted this long in the music industry?
Well, that's why it's funny because I was getting asked that more and more by some of my peers and friends, and then younger artists. Like, it's a super fickle industry I'm in. And going back to 2002, when I met Alan Kovac, he said, hey, I got all this. You got this one thing. You need to, that wake up call, like, oh shit. For me, it's always been seeking out, how do I get better? Collaborating with different people. When I work with different people, by osmosis, I'm affected by them. So when I'm in a collaboration and I check my ego and say, hey, I'm around a lot of talented people and I listen, that's when we get a great song. That's when we get a great business idea. So I'm always about don't micromanage, listen. You can always get better. And then also there's something I've talk about in the book. It's called Filling the Well, which is really continuing education. And like I mentioned earlier, when you're young, you're full of inspiration. But as you get older and go through your career, you got to continue to seek it out. And, so there's the creative side. Like for me, it's listening to new music. I'm always going down the rabbit hole with new artists. And so when I sit down in front of an artist, a younger artist, or even in a business, I'm listening to new things. So but you can't help but be influenced. So like I'll be listening to some song on New Music Friday, and then I sit down an hour later in that next session with a 20-year-old, but I play something that sounds relevant. If I played if I played Good from 1995, they'd go like, this sounds like my grandpa's music. But it's also, but Filling the Well also extends to business, and there's no end. There's no excuse to not know what's happening in your business. There are podcasts, books, radio, trade journals, to let you know what's happening in your business. And when you know what's happening in your business, you're able to connect the dots. It's like you go from a checkers player to the girl in Queen's Gambit or Bobby Fischer. You become a chess champion because you can see the next moves. So like we all have great ideas. Like for me, I have a great song idea. You may have a great idea in tech, in business, but how do you get it to the finish line? How do you connect the dots to get it to the person who can make that thing? There's no end to resources to know what's happening in your business. Where are the executives moving? Who is now working at a company you couldn't, break into? Well, if you were reading your trade journals and listening to podcasts, you knew that person is now, for me, it's Sony Records, and then also embracing your competition, the people who are crushing it. Don't resent them, like, I'm better than that. Say, no, wow, they're having success. I can learn from that. For me, I hear a hit song that I should have written with Ed Sheeran that day, but Ryan Tedder got it. Then I listen to the song and I'm like, wow, it's a really good song. And then without fail, I'm using one of the tricks of that song in my own song. So I know it's a long-winded answer, but it's always about, those are two of the things I talk about in the book. The other one is changing your attitude, and it's attitude, not maybe what your parents or your coach would tell you, Joe, you need to change your attitude, but it's attitude, how it's used in aviation. And there's a scene in the book where our protagonist, Jake, goes up in an old Cessna 150 with this old guy named Shane Sawyer, and they do barrel rolls, and he teaches them about attitude in aviation, which is your orientation to the Earth's surface. Like altitude is how high you are from the ground. Attitude is what is your orientation? Is your nose down? Is your tail up? Are you yawing to the left or right? Specifically, when you're landing a plane, how do you land it? So if in a songwriting session, the way I land it or complete my task is I'm usually start on the guitar, but sometimes I'm just hitting a brick wall, that's not working. So I got to change my attitude. I got to change my angle of approach. So I start with a lyric. If that doesn't work, I use a beat. Let's just come up with it. Let's build a cool beat on the computer. If that's not working, take a great song and reverse engineer it. Start breaking apart the component ideas of a great idea. And it doesn't just have to be a song. It can be a business you love. What are the things you love about that business? What are the component parts? And then when you start changing your attitude, you do it with a beat or a lyric or reverse engineer. Without fail, suddenly an idea comes out of that. And without even knowing it, you're accomplishing what was you were in a creative deadlock for. So yeah.
Kevin, as you can tell from our conversation, I like to keep things very simple, and I boil things down a lot to a lot of the issues whether it's in politics, whether it's in people's home lives, whether it's in their business, is curiosity or their lack of curiosity. Like no one really wants to know what the other person's feeling. And that's kind of one of the reasons I love podcasting. I really like to get to know people. And it seems like curiosity has been a huge part of your career, right?
Absolutely. What I realize is that for me is that how I conduct myself in business, if I do it right, that if I conduct myself that way in my personal life and with my friendships, I just found it's all connected. There's this line on just how to conduct yourself and how to continue to be curious. The kiss of death in music, but anything, is getting cynical and jaded. If you're cynical about the potential of your relationship to continue going, it's going to be over. So, collaboration, listening to each other, always seeking to be inspired, getting out of your own way, leaving your comfort zone. When you listen in a relationship with your spouse and you get a little bit of self-awareness, like, wow, I can learn something, I can get better, I can be the best version of myself. That's when life gets really great, and not only business, but relationships wise. And you're right. When it gets to a point where you don't listen to each other, when you don't check your ego at the door, when you lose self-awareness, that's when relationships fall apart. And that's when you're done, but for me, in my life, and that's kind of why I wanted to share in the book, when I stayed open to possibility and wide-eyed and continued having a sense of wonder, that's when life has continued to open up for me. Because I don't believe in a second act. I believe in a third act and a fourth act and a fifth act. And there's no reason to, because I see it. I see it in people around me. And I didn't just wake up and have that. It was through living life, and that's kind of why I wanted, and it sounds cheesy. I'm in my 50s now, and you want to have purpose. You want to leave something behind. And part of it was, hey, this worked for me. And these kind of things I do work for me. And I'm not making them up. These are things that work for other people, and they worked for many years for people. There's just truth and there's wisdom. And so I was able to put it into this story about this musician, and it's fun and it's cool.
All right. So you may not want to answer this last question, but a long time ago, I was talking to Jason Mraz, and as a lot of people may know, he had a huge hit song with I'm Yours. I think it's still one of the longest running Billboard hits of all time. And I said to him, hey, would you be able to retire just from that song alone? Just like, if you bought Apple stock back in the 80s. And he said, yeah, but I don't want to, because I love making music. I love touring. I love connecting with people. So yeah, I probably could, but I don't want to. So the question is, what is your sort of IRA song? What song that you had that you could probably be like, okay, I'm done, I can retire thanks to this song?
I tell you, a song that's the gift that keeps giving is Collide. I wrote that Howie Day. That song continues to get used so much. It's called a cop. Those kind of songs like Jason Mraz, I'm Yours, they're called a copyright. They're an evergreen because you have a hit and then you have recurrent, meaning it just keeps getting played. It's just part of the playlist of America. And good is that too. But I think good and Collide. Look, I've had number ones, but look, I'm Yours was a worldwide number one. Have I had a worldwide number one? No. So while Mraz has that one, it takes me two to equal to his. And can I retire? And I don't even think about that, man. I like the process of it. I will continue playing. I'll be playing music up on a stage when it's really, really sad. Like, oh my God, did you hear that guy from Better Than Ezra? He's 75 and he dropped dead,
I, for one, would love to see that. His name is Kevin Griffin. You can see his band Better Than Ezra on tour this summer, and his book, The Greatest Song, is available now. Kevin, thanks so much for the time. I really appreciate it.
Brother, thank you.
And that's going to do it for this episode of Good Listen. If you enjoyed the show and you're watching on YouTube, hit that thumbs up button. It's a small gesture, but it really helps the channel. If you're listening on Apple or Spotify, a 5-star review would be awesome. And if you want to catch up on past episodes or read my blog, go to joepardavila.com. Until next time, adios.